Before I begin this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. All right, here's how it all began. It was a late afternoon in early spring, one of those days where the air still carried a chill, but sunlight spilled through the curtains like a promise of warmth. I remember sitting by the kitchen window, my cup of tea growing cold, staring out at the lilac bushes that had just started to bloom. Life had settled into a kind of quiet rhythm after my divorce. Comfortable, predictable, maybe a little too predictable. My brother, Paul, is a literature professor at the university nearby. He's always been the academic type, scatterbrained, but with a heart of gold. That day he called me out of the blue. He needed a favor. One of his students, a young man named Daniel, was preparing a project on community storytelling. Paul thought I could help, since I'd spent years writing short pieces for local magazines and hosting little story circles at the library. He's polite, thoughtful, Paul said. You'll like him. Just keep an open mind. He's a bit different. Different. I didn't think much of it at the time. When Daniel arrived that Saturday afternoon, I remember opening the door and being caught off guard, not by his appearance, but by his presence. He was maybe in his late 20s, tall, with that quiet confidence some people have without even trying. He smiled in that easy, genuine way that makes you feel like he's truly glad to meet you. His eyes carried a kind of curiosity, the kind that notices details other people miss. Thank you for having me, he said, stepping inside, glancing around at my shelves of books, my old typewriter on the desk. Your brother told me you have stories hidden in every corner of this house. I laughed, a little self-conscious. Well, I suppose that's true. Some of them even made it to paper. We spent that afternoon in my living room, the air filled with the faint scent of cedar and lemon polish. He asked questions that went far beyond what I expected. Not just about writing, but about why I wrote, about what memories I held onto, and which ones I tried to forget. At first, I answered out of habit, like I was giving a polite interview. But something about his attention, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he seemed to weigh each word I said as though it mattered, began to shift something in me. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone listened like that. As the hours passed, our conversation wandered. We talked about regret, about courage, about the small choices that shape entire lives. The kind of talk you don't plan, that just happens when two people forget the clock is ticking. At one point, I caught myself watching him as he scribbled notes, his handwriting quick and uneven, his brow furrowed in thought. There was a focus in him, a kind of earnestness that reminded me of who I used to be, before routine and caution had dulled my edges. When evening came, I offered him dinner. He insisted on helping, chopping vegetables as we talked about the stories people hide inside themselves. The kitchen felt alive, warm, almost like a scene from one of those quiet films that stay with you long after the credits roll. Before he left that night, Daniel said something that lingered long after he'd gone. He said, standing by the door, you talk about stories as if they belong to other people. But I think your own story isn't finished yet. I smiled politely, brushing it off, but his words hit somewhere deep. I stood there for a while after he drove away, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of the trees outside. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was unsettled, but because something in me had been stirred, like a long-forgotten melody finding its rhythm again. I didn't know it then, but that visit would change how I saw myself, and how I understood connection. It was the beginning of something I never expected to feel again. The following weekend, Daniel returned, this time without my brother's prompting. He texted me earlier that morning, asking if he could drop by to share the progress on his project. I hesitated for a moment before replying, "Sure." Truthfully, I'd been thinking about our last conversation all week. There was something refreshing about the way he saw the world, unburdened by cynicism or the dullness that tends to creep in with age and disappointment. When I opened the door, the air was crisp with the smell of rain. Daniel held a notebook under his arm and wore that same easy smile that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a story himself. He shook off a few raindrops before stepping inside. "I brought something for you," he said, handing me a small jar filled with what looked like beach sand, "from the shoreline near campus. I thought you might like it. You said you grew up near the coast." I turned the jar over in my hand, the sand shifting softly inside. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, surprised he'd remembered such a small detail. We settled at the kitchen table again, the same place where our first conversation had unfolded. My house felt different this time, less like a space I lived in alone, and more like a quiet companion to our conversations. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the window panes, a rhythm that seemed to underline every word we spoke. Daniel showed me pages from his notebook filled with handwritten quotes, bits of dialogue, sketches of faces and streets. He wanted to include a segment about how personal memories shape community storytelling, and he asked if I'd share one of my own stories for the project. I hesitated. Most of mine aren't very interesting, just ordinary life. He shook his head. That's what makes them powerful. The ordinary moments are what people connect to. So I told him about the time I nearly moved to Chicago in my 20s, how I'd packed everything, had the ticket in hand, but couldn't bring myself to go. I told him about my mother, who always said that roots grow stronger than wings if you're not careful. Daniel listened like it was the first story he'd ever heard. When I finished, there was a quiet moment where neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rain softening into a drizzle. "You stayed," he said finally. "Do you ever regret it?" I looked out the window. Sometimes. But then again, staying gave me different stories. Ones I wouldn't trade now. He smiled, and for a second, it felt like we were sharing something more than words, like an unspoken understanding of how choices define us. Later, as we stood in the doorway, and he prepared to leave, he turned back and said, "Would it be all right if I came again next week? I'd like to hear more of your stories." I nodded before I could think about it. Yes, of course. After he left, I noticed the jar of sand still sitting on the table. The light from the window caught the grains, turning them golden. It reminded me of days long gone, of standing by the ocean, feeling small but alive. That night, I found myself writing again for the first time in months. Words flowed more easily, as if Daniel's visit had opened a window in a room I'd forgotten existed. I wrote about the sound of rain on glass, the smell of old books, and the way a stranger's curiosity can feel like sunlight after a long winter. I didn't realize it yet, but those quiet afternoons with Daniel were beginning to stir a part of me that had been asleep for far too long. Each visit chipped away at the walls I'd built around myself, revealing something I thought I'd lost, the simple joy of being truly seen. Daniel's visits became a quiet rhythm in my weeks, never planned, but always welcome. Sometimes he'd bring coffee from the small cafe near campus, or a new question about storytelling that would lead us into hours of conversation. There was nothing hurried about our time together. It was calm, almost meditative, as if the world slowed down whenever he walked through my front door. One Saturday afternoon, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything outside look softer. I was in the garden trimming back the rose bushes when I heard his voice from the gate. "You really do have a storyteller's garden," he said, smiling as he walked up the path. "Every flower looks like it's keeping a secret." I laughed, brushing the dirt from my hands. Or maybe they're just tired of me talking to them every morning. He helped me carry the tools back to the porch, and we sat for a while, sipping lemonade. The air smelled faintly of soil and rain. It felt easy. No expectations, no performances, just two people existing in the same gentle moment. After a while, Daniel said quietly, "You know, I've been thinking about what you said last time, about staying instead of going. I keep wondering if we ever really know which choices were right until much later." His words hung in the air, as though he wasn't just asking about me, but himself too. I looked at him, noticing a kind of weight in his expression that I hadn't seen before. "Maybe there isn't a right choice," I said, "just the one you make, and what you do with it after." He nodded slowly, then pulled out his notebook. "Would you mind if I wrote that down?" "Not at all," I said, smiling. "But you'll owe me a quote credit in your project." We both laughed, but the laughter faded into a comfortable silence. I realized how natural it felt having him there, like an old friend I'd somehow just met. It was strange, but comforting. Later that afternoon, we moved inside when the sky opened up and the rain began to fall harder. The living room filled with the sound of it drumming softly against the windows. I lit a few candles as the daylight dimmed, and we talked about books, his favorites, mine, and the ones that had shaped us. At one point, he picked up a photograph from my mantel. It was of me and Paul years ago standing by the lake with my late husband, Mark. His eyes softened as he looked at it. "You must have loved him very much," he said. "I did," I answered. "We had our years, some good, some hard. Losing him wasn't sudden, but it still felt like the world stopped for a while." He looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever feel like you've started living again?" I paused before answering. "I think. I'm learning how." Daniel didn't say anything for a while. He just nodded, and in that quiet, there was an understanding that didn't need words. It wasn't sympathy, it was connection. Before he left that evening, he stood by the door as always, that familiar hesitant smile on his face. "You know," he said softly, "your stories are changing my project. But more than that, they are changing how I see people." After he was gone, I found myself sitting in the same chair he'd been in, the scent of rain still lingering in the air. There was something undeniably human about the exchange we'd built. No grand gestures, no declarations. Just two souls meeting in the small spaces life had left open. That night, as I wrote in my journal, I realized how much lighter I felt. It wasn't just about Daniel. It was about rediscovering my own voice, my own capacity to feel deeply, to care again. His presence had reminded me that even after loss, even after years of quiet living, it's still possible for the heart to wake up. I closed my notebook and listened to the rain. For the first time in a long while, it sounded less like a memory, and more like a beginning. Weeks passed, and Daniel's visits became less about his project and more about shared moments that didn't need a reason. Sometimes he'd come by to read me a passage from his notes, other times just to sit quietly with a cup of coffee while I worked in the garden. The space between us had settled into something warm and familiar, a kind of friendship that felt both grounding and alive. One Sunday afternoon, as autumn began to settle in, Daniel called to say he'd finished his project and wanted to show it to me before presenting it to his class. The leaves outside had just started to turn, and the house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the apple pie cooling on the counter. When he arrived, he seemed a little nervous, holding a worn leather folder in his hands. "I owe this to you," he said as I opened the door. "You've been a part of it more than you realize." We sat at the table, the same one where our first conversation had begun months ago. He laid the folder in front of me and opened it. Inside were pages filled with words, snippets of our talks, reflections about storytelling, and fragments of his own thoughts. But what caught me most was the title, "The Stories That Find Us." As I read, I felt my throat tighten. He had written about how people carry unspoken stories, how sometimes they need someone else to listen before they can hear themselves. My name wasn't there, but I could feel myself in every line. It wasn't about me exactly. It was about how connection can awaken a person, how shared honesty can mend what time has dulled. When I looked up, Daniel was watching me carefully. "Does it feel true?" he asked. "It feels honest," I said, "and beautiful." He smiled, the kind of smile that carries both pride and gratitude. "I'm glad. I was afraid I might have said too much." "No," I replied softly. "You said just enough." We sat in silence for a while after that, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock marking the moment. Then he told me he'd been offered a fellowship in another state, a chance to expand his work, to travel and collect more stories. My heart sank a little, but I didn't show it. I knew this was what he was meant to do. "When do you leave?" I asked. "Next month," he said. "I wanted to tell you in person. You've been important to this journey." I smiled, though I felt something shift inside me. "Then you'll have new stories to chase. That's what writers do." He nodded. "And I'll carry yours with me. The one about choosing to stay. It taught me something. That sometimes staying isn't about fear. It's about faith in what's already here." His words struck me deeply. I wanted to tell him how much his visits had changed me, how they reminded me of who I was before life got too quiet. But I didn't. Instead, I walked him to the door, as I always did. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long and golden over the yard. Daniel turned before stepping off the porch. "You once said your story wasn't finished," he said. "I think you're about to start a new chapter." When he drove away, I stood there for a long time, listening to the faint hum of his car disappearing down the road. The world felt both emptier and fuller at once. That evening, I took the jar of sand from the shelf and set it on the windowsill. The sun caught it, making it glow softly. I realized that change doesn't always come through grand moments. It often arrives quietly, in conversations over tea, in the steady presence of someone who listens without judgment. I started writing again, not for publication, not even to share, just to remember. I wrote about how one unexpected visit had reminded me that connection can come when you least expect it, and that no matter your age, it's never too late to rediscover wonder. By the time the last of the daylight faded, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the kind born of stillness, but the kind that comes when you finally understand that life, in all its twists and gentle turns, still has stories left to tell. Don't forget to give us like and subscribe this video.